Welcome to Book Launch, the UK's most widely distributed books magazine for all intellectual interests. And in this podcast, we're asking Philip Seargeant about his book, The Art of Political Storytelling. We think of storytelling as a type of entertainment, mainly for children. It's also a type of lying. And with Donald Trump and his retinue, and Boris Johnson and his, it is now unapologetically the primary narrative of the English-speaking political establishment. We've always known that politicians tell lies ad hoc, of course, but lies as a systematic and relentless way of entertaining the politically innocent, of holding their attention and winning their affection, this seems new. Philip Seargeant is interested in how this has happened and how it works. We've asked Tim Hay of bookspodcast.com to talk to him.
It seems to me that the problem for the political left is the right seem to have the knack of codifying their message into a usually mendacious slogan or a narrative of some sort. That's what drew me to The Art of Political Storytelling by Philip Seargeant. And Philip joins me now. Now, by political storytelling, you mean something different from simply explaining the issues and outlining the solutions?
Yes, what I was looking at in the book was specifically how political storytelling works as a persuasive tool. It's a type of rhetoric, a type of way of engaging people, particularly engaging their emotions. So putting across a message, sometimes that's related to issues, sometimes that's much more related to values, but doing so in a way which cuts through and resonates with people and thus works as a political tool.
You use the movies Star Wars and High Noon as examples.
What I look at in the book is the way that there's this idea of archetypal stories, a lot of Hollywood scripts and a lot of other stories, and often this structure is one which is particularly engaging. It involves a journey, some challenges, and the hero coming out well in the end. And Star Wars, or indeed High Noon, are sort of examples of this. In Star Wars, it's the lone farmhand taking on the evil empire, along with a bunch of other sort of assembled rebels. In High Noon, it's the one sheriff being abandoned by the rest of the township and taking on this marauding posse of outlaws. And as I say, these are sort of archetypal in that we see that basic structure in thousands, hundreds of thousands of stories. And the reason we do that is because it's a particularly engaging story about overcoming challenges, the outsider against a much larger, more powerful villain. And if you look at the way that a lot of people these days are pitching their character as politicians, they use a very similar story archetype. So even someone like Donald Trump, who's part of the elite in many ways, can pitch himself as a political outsider, someone coming in to shake up Washington, to take on the powers of evil and so forth. That was the basic purpose of using that as an analogy. I think it's always the case. I mean, if you look, all politicians to some extent seem to position themselves as either the underdog, because again, that's a classic story of the underdog, or as some sort of outsider who will shake things up. It's especially the case now, I think, with this idea of populist politics that we're seeing.
The Trump story, of course, maps particularly well onto this because you make very clear that in the stories there's usually a sort of a secure home position that the hero has to leave to brave the terror.
You see that same story in all sorts of different contexts, not least reality TV, where again you have that journey of someone as an outsider being pushed or pushing themselves into a new situation, overcoming challenges, often institutional challenges, against the odds. So he's very good at that. He's an extremely good self-publicist. And part of that is creating this particular character for himself and being able to not manipulate the media, but sort of antagonize media so that he's in constant attention.
So it's politics as a game show or as reality TV, really, as opposed.
It's become, I think we've seen over the last, it's not just Trump, over the last 30, 40 years, we've definitely seen politics as entertainment becoming, or entertainment and politics coming together much, much more, since Reagan.
Was there a time, are you suggesting, when political discourse was about explaining a problem and presenting a solution, as opposed to offering yourself as an archetypal hero?
I think it's always been both. Politicians always, part of the thing they're articulating in terms of issues is values, a vision of what the nation or the community or whatever it is aspiring to. So there's always been a political story that politicians are using. I mean, every nation has its own founding story or its own political story or its own idea of identity, which is based on our story. So there's always been that aspect of it, but there's also always been sort of the practical aspect of policy suggestions, dealing with issues, competence, all these sorts of things. There's a balance between those two. So the storytelling isn't necessarily problematic. It's part of the way we see ourselves as a nation, as a people, as a community, as individuals. And a good politician will tap into that and use that as a way of engaging with people.
Well, that leads us on to the other poster boy event of recent times, which is, of course, Brexit. The interesting thing about Brexit, I think, in terms of your book, is that both sides did eventually attempt to go with the narrative approach. But the Leave camp were brilliantly successful at using narrative, and the Remain camp were abysmally bad.
The Leave camp had the idea of change on their side. Now, in politics, but also in narrative and in storytelling, change is sort of essential. Any story is about something changing. And of course, the Leave campaign had that. I mean, the Remain campaign was arguing for the status quo, which was problematic in many ways anyway. And also, it's very difficult to argue for the status quo. The narrative had been built up over decades that the EU was an empire of evil, that it was full of faceless bureaucrats, technocrats, taking away our freedoms. So there was a ready-made narrative there for them to slip into. I mean, governments have always used the EU as an excuse. So it stands to reason that that narrative was ready-made to an extent.
You've mentioned populism already. You tie that in with fake news. And fake news almost is a more recent thing, isn't it?
Spin was a big thing in the 90s. Propaganda has always been around. So to an extent, there's nothing particularly new in that. But fake news, because of the way that social media allows for circulation of information and people interacting with that information, means that the possibility either to completely fabricate things, so to make up news stories, often based on these archetypes we've been talking about, or to put a spin on stories and information, so to make them distorted, has become more a part of the culture than it has been in the past. It's very much always been there, that we've always had newspapers who spin things, and we've always had politicians trying to either do it themselves or do it through the newspapers. But now it's reached a sort of more of a crisis point than I think it has in the past, or at least the recent past.
If we want to correct this phenomenon, what do we do? How do you counter populism, fake facts, all of these highly mendacious phenomena?
Ultimately, it's going to be down to the ethics of the politicians, I think. Whatever you do, if you then have the leader of the free world and his support network making blatant falsehoods, it's very difficult for a media company to try and track down a few fake news stories and make sure they don't get the circulation that they have been. I do think social media has been a huge part of this. Partly the way that the social media company's business model works is to, keep people on their platforms, and part of human nature that people like salacious stories full of conflict, sensational stories. In that sense, fictional stories are able to do that much more easily than fact-based stories. So to an extent, the social media companies and regulation around that, I think, can make a difference. Ultimately, as I say, if you've got a leader who is happy to lie outright and then his support network doesn't take action over that or doesn't disagree with that, then you're in a very tricky situation.
You say in the book that it's no longer a question of left and right, that what we're now looking at is a conflict between surface reality and real truth, or the truth beneath.
There are certain issues where the sort of traditional idea of left and right don't sort of map on. And coming back to the idea of populism is not necessarily an ideology in the same way that conservatism is or liberalism is. It's more a particular narrative. And this is why you're seeing populists on both the left and the right, certainly the right more in terms of national populism, because it's a narrative or a mindset which is particularly critical of the idea of the establishment and established political class. And so that's why we're getting this sort of complication more than possibly we've had for the last 30 years or something.
That was Philip Seargeant talking to Tim Hay of bookspodcast.com about his book, The Art of Political Storytelling, published by Bloomsbury. To buy a copy of the book at the best discount, visit the Book Launch online bookshop at booklaunch.london/sales. And do subscribe to Book Launch by visiting booklaunch.london/subscribe to receive the print edition of our magazine.